It's a great pleasure to welcome you all here today to this Caabu online briefing on climate change in the Middle East. And I really am excited about this because this is a really important and vital issue. It's one I hope that we are going to address a great deal more over the coming months because it obviously is having such a huge impact on the globe as well as the Middle East. And I've always been struck by the lack of attention perhaps that has been paid to the way in which climate change, environmental destruction is not really covered in terms of the Middle East, except for a few select few, including our very distinguished speaker today. And that we have now seen in recent years that it actually has become a feature even of protests in countries like Iraq and Lebanon, and that increasingly it's far more on the agenda. And we've seen issues of air and water quality, extreme heat. It's not just in northwest Canada, wildfires, dust storms, threats from rising sea levels, desertification. And, you know, in response to that, we are also beginning to see an emerging renewable energy market and changes there in reaction. Of course, it's going to need a great deal more. And of course, it's timely, given that this year in November, Britain will be hosting the UN Climate Change Conference, COP26 in Glasgow. It's a very important moment. And indeed, you know, the government has made it its #1 foreign policy priority. So we have somebody who can really introduce us to this topic and take us through it. Dr. Michael Mason, he's the director of the Middle East Center at LSE in the Department of Associate Professor in the Department of Geography and Environment and Associate of the Grantham Research Institute for Climate Change and the Environment. And his research interests encompass environmental politics and governance. And he's written widely in academic journals and commented on this issue for a long time. So, Michael, a very warm welcome to you. We're going to hear from you first. And as ever, if anybody in the audience has any questions, if you could very kindly pop them in the chat, that would be great. And we can really hope to take us through some of the most major challenges, perhaps, that you see for the region and how they may be addressed. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Chris, and thanks to Caabu for this warm invitation. And the steer I had on this was just to provide a kind of broad overview on issues of climate change in the Middle East, which is what I've attempted to do. But of course, this is a very big issue, and I can't claim to be comprehensive in what I say. So hopefully, if there are things I'm missing out, please feel free to raise them in the questions. I'm a geographer. I have a kind of dual kind of natural science, social science background, although since my doctorate, I focus on the social science side, so more on the governance and politics side. But I'll try and deal with any questions as they come, both technical and more general policy and governance. Now, I'm gonna, if I can, share a screen with you because I have a presentation. Can you see the presentation?
We can.
Oh, good. Right, I'll go to presentation. Okay, so I'll just take 20 to 30 minutes. I'm just going to present some broad sort of themes and issues. And as I said, I've done work on water and climate in some specific areas in the Middle East, and I might mention some of those in the presentation. But at least for this, and most recently, I've been doing some work on water infrastructure in southern Iraq. But this is a kind of introductory presentation. My apologies if this is either too technical or not technical enough for you, because I know we have a very diverse audience. But hopefully I've drafted it in a way which is both understandable and useful. So climate change. I think we're now at the situation where the sort of climate change deniers are in a very, very small shrinking minority. it's very clear that there's strong scientific consensus that we have climate change, that in recent decades, the major kind of driver of that climate change are human anthropogenic sort of influences. Just to give you a couple of facts here, just to set the scene up, compared to pre-industrial levels, in terms of the amount of carbon in the atmosphere, prior to the Industrial Revolution in Britain, we had 280 parts per million CO2. Most recent observation I have from the Mauna Loa Observatory in Hawaii was 419 parts per million CO2 in May 2021 this year. That's an almost 50% increase. Okay, over in that time also the global average temperature has increased something over 1 degree centigrade. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which is like the lead scientific body bringing together research from around the world on climate change, in its most recent kind of special report on climate change in 2018, it said we're due to hit, on current emission levels, we're due to hit about 1.5 degrees centigrade between 2030, 2052. So that's coming fast. According to the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, any increase in global average temperature 1.5 degrees centigrade and above is what's called dangerous climate change. Dangerous climate change being that stage where we start to encounter a possibly sort of system shifting kind of changes to global climate, meaning there are things that might happen which we may not be sure in terms of the impact, and we might have the onset of all sorts of feedbacks, positive feedbacks, which might increase the impact further in a very short time. So these things, when people are saying at the moment about we have 10 years to act, many of you say, well, I've been hearing that said for years and years and years in the past. I think to a large extent, that's very much the case at the moment. We do really only have like 10 years to act to turn around the current kind of trends in terms of global atmospheric emissions. If we want to try to keep climate change to 1.5 degrees centigrade, ideally, that's the goal of the Paris Agreement, the UN Paris Agreement back in 2015, or at least no more than 2 degrees centigrade increase of global average temperature compared to pre-industrial levels. Anyway, this presentation is on climate change in the Middle East. What happens is that, and I'll refer to some papers, and in all these slides, I'll reference the papers. So if you want to follow up where the research and science is coming from. Projections on climate change are based in terms of concentration pathways. In other words, the amounts of sort of emissions, greenhouse gas emissions we're pushing to the atmosphere. Scientists make different assumptions about how much we'll be pushing into the atmosphere in terms of current emission levels, if they're going to go up, if they're going to go down, if they're going to stay the same. We have something called representative concentration pathways, RCPs. There are 4 of these. I've picked a paper which looks at 2 of these, which cover the so-called intermediate and worst case scenario. Intermediate scenario being RCP 4.5, which means we have declining emissions, but still dangerous climate change happening, and a global temperature rise above 2 degrees centigrade compared to pre-industrial levels, and RCP 8.5, which is the worst case scenario, no emissions decline, with a kind of scary rise in temperature pushing on to 5 degrees centigrade by the end of the century. This is from a paper looking at the impact of climate change. If you remember, 8.5 is more serious climate change, impact on the Middle East on precipitation variation in winter on the basis of these projections. And one thing you'll see here, which I think is interesting, is if many people think about climate change as meaning only drying, only warming in the Middle East. You'll see here on the Arabian Peninsula, some areas where precipitation is going up, okay? One thing about climate change to remember, climate change is creating a global atmosphere where, if you like, there's more energy in that atmosphere. That increased energy means storm tracks, rainfall patterns are changed, and it can and is projected to lead to, or predicted to lead to, increased rainfall, particularly more localized rainfall and also high temperature events in particular localities. One of the things about this we have to be careful is that in terms of this increased rainfall here, we're talking about rainfall amounts in the southeast of the Arabian Peninsula, which are already relatively small. So we have here large relative increases, but these large relative increases are in relation to existing small amounts. So we're not talking here about great increases in rainfall. This is just to give you an indication of variation depends on the emissions pathway that we are in. And the emissions pathway that we are in as we progress through the century depends on the actions that we take now. The actions particularly of states around climate change mitigation and also climate change adaptation. So we go to the same represented concentration pathways, these emission pathways, 4.5, the so-called intermediate scenario, 8.5, the more serious global warming scenario. And here you get a sense in terms of increased sort of average temperature compared to a sort of 1986, 2005 control. And here you see the temperature increase on the more serious scenario is by the end of the century, as I just said, going up to 5 degrees centigrade. So this is very serious in terms of impacts, has all sorts of substantial impacts in the region, particularly in perhaps received first by those countries which have, for example, a high dependence on rainfed agriculture. We can perhaps come back to that. So I'm just putting out there some general trends. The projections on climate change are that not only do the average kind of temperature and precipitation sort of rates change, but we also have increased incidence of heat extremes. This was a heat extreme in the region from last summer. We've got an event where temperature went up to 52 degrees centigrade in Basra. And the projections are that these sorts of heat extremes will be received more often. Some of you might be aware what's happening, has been happening in the Pacific Northwest and North America is being discussed as an example of this. This is something that has to be factored into particularly in terms of habitability. What sort of livability is possible in environments where we have very, very extreme temperatures? One of the things that is projected from increased sort of temperature rise from global warming is sea level rise. And as many of you will know, certain parts of the Middle East are particularly exposed to sea level rise. This is a sort of a model looking at the impacts. I'm sorry, you probably can't see the temperature indicator. On the right, 2 degrees warming. On the left, 4 degrees warming. Impact on Abu Dhabi. And here we see Abu Dhabi, 1.5 million population, 80% living in coastal areas. Major impact, even with 2 degrees warming. 2 degrees warming is kind of where we're going to go to, I think. Yeah. Even with 2 degrees warming, you have major problems in terms of sea level rise. And this can also lead to increased salinization of groundwater. And 4 degrees, even more comprehensive. This can be seen across the region. I'll just give you one more picture here of Haifa in Israel. Again, on the right, 2 degrees warming. On the left, 4 degrees warming. The impacts, the challenges to coastal populations are very great from global warming. And this is something that countries are going to have to react to and already are starting to in terms of discussion about adaptation. This will involve, I think, inevitably, major population movements. Many people talk about climate change triggering migration. I think, yes, you know, that will be the case, but it will also trigger or require countries to plan population movements within their countries insofar as they cannot protect or do not have the technical resources, financial resources. We might argue the Israelis will have financial resources, technical resources to be able to adapt to much of this sea level rise. Now, one of the things I want to say in this talk, just to provide this context, is the preoccupation with the discussion of climate change in the region, I think often leads to us not taking into account the current stresses on water, which are actually, I would say, currently more substantial in terms of challenges to both livelihoods and livability in the Middle East. One of these, for example, we can call unsustainable groundwater extraction. All the countries in the region are seeing a decline in groundwater reserves. Recent academic paper, which I cite on this slide, is seeing the greatest extraction in Iraq and Kuwait, or at least the greatest volumes, largest declines in Iraq, Kuwait, Syria, and Lebanon in recent years. This is a nice photograph from another article on the left from Nature magazine of Wadi Rum in Jordan, which shows you the use of groundwater to grow crops in crop circles in a situation which is not viable ecologically unless you do this in an unsustainable manner, unless you're drawing on groundwater a rate in excess of that which is sustainable. This would not be happening. So one of the challenges with climate change is, and I'm saying that this is already happening in terms of groundwater extraction. Now, of course, groundwater availability is affected by climate change, but the current groundwater extraction here is something which is human caused, of course, and I think much more important in terms of the extraction rate and the stress than the climate change impact. We also have demographic growth in the Middle East. Some very, very large population increases in the region projected till mid-century, even though there are declining fertility rates. Because of the large populations, the large younger cohorts in the populations, we have, for example, GCC population, including migrant workers. These are from UN statistics, expected to reach 76 million from 2050. And in the Mashreq, the population going from 72 million in 1980 to reach 300 million in 2050. Sometimes the discussion of climate change in the region tends to neglect population increase. But again, this demographic pressure, this demographic growth is something which is, at least I would argue at the moment, a more important factor in terms of water scarcity in the region than climate change. Another factor, unregulated transboundary water flows. A photograph of the Iluzu Dam on the right in Turkey, which Turkey has been filling up in the past 10 years or so. Iluzu Dam, projected by Iraqi water officials to reduce Tigris River flows, already reduced, from other upstream infrastructure to by over 50%. This has, of course, an impact. And the Tigris actually has less dams on it than the Euphrates. Both the Euphrates and the Tigris, at least since the 1970s, no longer have what we might call natural flow regimes. The flow regimes are so modified by upstream infrastructure in Syria, in Iraq itself, in Turkey, and in terms of their confluence in the Shatt al-Arab, also in terms of upstream infrastructure in Iran. This unregulated transboundary water flows, projection or calculations that Iraq's lost a third of its surface area of water in the last 35 years. This is something which is being caused more by dam infrastructure construction than climate change. Again, so I'm not saying that climate change is not a significant stress, and that stress will increase in the future, including in the near future. We must always factor this in or discuss it in the context, at least in terms of water, in which water budgets, water scarcity have been incredibly pressured or stressed by other factors. Now, in terms of what international community is doing, Chris mentioned the Conference of the Parties of the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change in Glasgow in November, the 26th Conference of the Parties to UNFCCC. Currently, the international community is not on track to meet its Paris Agreement climate goals to avoid dangerous climate change. Many countries under the Paris Agreement, most UNFCCC countries have committed to limit their greenhouse gas emissions under what are called nationally determined contributions. However, these commitments are not enough to avoid dangerous climate change. This is a graphic, a couple of years old now, in 2019 on the right, showing that the great difference between what we need to do to limit global warming to sort of safe levels and where we are. And we're kind of almost, we have to substantially increase all countries, their commitments to reduce greenhouse gas emissions to reach a level at which we can keep sort of global warming within the so-called kind of safe zone of 1.5 to 2 degrees centigrade above pre-industrial levels. Middle Eastern state nationally determined contributions, NDCs as they're called, there tends to be an absence of quantitative emission targets, but often a commitment to renewable energy generation. Like many developing countries, the NDCs of Middle Eastern states are highly conditional, meaning that we will make commitments to reduce emissions, but these are dependent on international financial support and technological transfers. This is very reasonable, we might argue, given that the historical responsibility for climate change is surely with those countries which have for a very long time, through industrial revolutions which took place 100, 200 years ago for some countries, benefited within their own economies from activities based on fossil fuels. And it would be unfair to require Middle Eastern states or the developing countries to make unconditional commitments. So I think there's an interesting question we might talk about maybe in the discussion questions around fairness, about who should do what and why. I published a paper recently with a colleague at Middle East Center looking at what's called climate policy integration, which is the extent to which you integrate climate policy considerations in mainstream decision-making, looking at UAE and Oman. And here we saw that there's a major commitment. It's focused on the energy sector, but it seems to be more about protecting rents for all exports. In other words, ensuring that domestic energy consumption is not using the fossil fuels which are going to be used for export. So there's a kind of a rental rationale to this sort of commitment to this renewable energy sector investment. However, I think this should be lauded. This sort of some of the major scale renewable energy investment taking place within the region. So one of the challenges for the region, and particularly for the Arab Gulf states, I think, is the fact they tend to have high capita emissions, some of the highest in the world. However, generally, going back to this idea of fairness, this is a graphic from a scientific paper which kind of categorizes the pledge categories of the different countries in terms of their nationally determined contributions in relation to per capita emissions in 2015, and in terms of the size of the bubbles in relation to their total emissions. So for example, the big bubble on the bottom left is China, which has about 10 billion tons per annum CO2 equivalent. UAE in comparison has 203 million. This categorization shows that at least the Gulf states, Saudi Arabia, they're in the pledge category of absent specific greenhouse gas emission targets. Okay, so their targets tend to be in terms of commitments to invest, for example, in renewable energy. In terms of absolute emission reduction commitments, these are in the box in box I. In box 2, you see business as usual reductions, and in category 3, emission intensity reductions, meaning the countries are committed to be more efficient, if you like, in terms of their economies, reducing the amount of fossil fuels needed to produce, if you like, 1 unit of output. I'm just highlighting this here in the sense that, just to give you a sense of the variation of commitments of different countries to different practices, and at least in terms of the Gulf states, being in a situation where they're not committing to specific reductions, but they do have high per capita emissions. But in terms of overall, and sometimes I mention this because sometimes the Gulf states are sometimes used as a whipping boy, as it were, for those that say, well, you know, they have these massive high per capita emissions of CO2 equivalent. But in context of overall global emissions, these are still relatively small. Okay. To what extent is there cooperation, regional cooperation? I'm just going to deal with briefly, rather than specific countries, regional cooperation. Research has shown, again, very useful, interesting report, co-authored by one of my colleagues in the Middle East Center, former colleague, Climate Change, Governance, and Cooperation in the Arab Region, published a couple of years ago by the Emirates Diplomatic Academy, is that the regional apparatus is not really helping the region to focus on effective means to address climate change, at least in terms of coordination. The League of Arab States has a series of impressive sounding groups, negotiation groups, various councils of ministers on the environment, and the Gulf Cooperation Council also has a committee on climate change. But these groups have been largely ineffective in terms of gathering the countries together in meaningful regional action. This is not to say that there may not be significant unilateral national action, but at least in terms of cooperation between Arab countries, it has not been significant in recent years. There is stuff happening. It's interesting, a recent survey, UN survey last year of 8 Arab countries, from that survey, 64% of people surveyed by the UN declared climate change to be an emergency. So there's a perception in the region that climate change is an issue. And one of the things that we notice with this is in terms of news coverage, is that climate change coverage in the region has traditionally been featured as foreign news, talking about international climate change negotiations. But in recent years, you're seeing more and more an awareness of this is something which has domestic implications. Some countries are taking quite seriously climate change communication. The photograph on the right is a photograph from UAE's National Environment Day to highlight or publicize the extent to which younger generations are educated about energy efficiency and climate change. Now, some of you are probably, at least in terms of the media, one of the things that we get quite a lot in terms of popular discussion in the blogosphere, particularly around climate change in the Middle East, is this idea of the climate change as somehow, could it be a trigger of conflict or an intensifier of conflict in the Middle East? And one of the, I think the most notable example of that, I've seen this apply to various countries. I've even seen this apply to Yemen, but I think that the most notable example from recent years is with the Syrian conflict, where correlations made between the 2006-2011 drought, the impacts of the drought on agriculture, migration of farmers, displaced farmers, leading to political protests. The kind of the key scientific, I would say, statement on this, there's lots of simplistic statements on this. The key scientific articulation of this thesis that climate change has a significant effect on the conflict was the Kelly et al. Article in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, which is a prestigious American scientific journal, that the drought between 2611 was a significant contribution to the conflict. Since that article, there's been a whole flurry of debate in the scholarship about this. And I'm just going to refer you to 2 articles, Jan Selby and colleagues in the Journal of Political Geography, and a really, really good book. This is a book launch we hosted at Middle East Center earlier this year, Marwa Dawoudi, the origins of Syrian conflict, climate change and human security. The scholarly consensus has been to say that the climate change was not even a trigger of the Syrian conflict, okay? The key factors were other causes, although there were climate change stresses at the time. We might perhaps come back to this in discussion or questions. But this is important because many think tanks are quite keen to rush into the debate and say climate change will be a trigger for conflict. Perhaps more meaningful in terms of discussion, maybe in terms of foreign policy, is could it be an intensifier of conflict, additional climate stresses? And here I can refer to a kind of country study. Back about 10 years ago, I did some work for UNDP, helping the Palestinian Authority develop their climate change adaptation strategy, which is on the left. And here we looked at projected risks of climate change in terms of warming, precipitation changes to the end of the century, and highlighted agriculture, particularly the dependence of rainfall agriculture in the West Bank, particularly as areas of high vulnerability, but other areas of vulnerability as well. And we adopted which is some of you will know this concept, the human security concept, which is quite well known within the UN system, developed by UNDP, applied to climate change to understand climate change as a threat to lives and livelihoods. There are, there's an interesting, of course, obvious contrast between the kind of physical water scarcity faced by Palestinians and the sort of technical removal of water scarcity as a problem by the Israelis with their major infrastructure used to both seawater desalination and their use of treated wastewater for agriculture. I should say, in terms of the climate change stress, the threats to water scarcity for the Palestinians is overwhelmingly not to do with climate change. It's overwhelmingly to do with the occupation and in terms of Gaza, the blockade. So one of the things we had to figure out in terms of the work we were doing is how to factor in these, if you like, conflict factors where UNDP was concerned we just deal with the kind of technical sort of exogenous, as it were, climate change sort of pressures. Interesting in terms of some of the sort of final status negotiations, or at least some of the discussions around final status negotiations, although Israel has kind of solved its own water scarcity problem for desalination, in terms of these, and I discussed this in an article referenced below in Geographical Journal some years ago, in terms of the final status negotiations, they were using climate change to say to the Palestinians, oh, well, we'd love to give you more fresh water, but we can't because of climate change. So climate change is used, it's been used in terms of sort of the Palestinian-Israeli discourse. Since then, Israelis have moved more towards the stance, okay, Palestinians, you can have more water, but we'll sell it to you. And of course, the Palestinians say, we're not going to buy our own water, although physically they're doing that anyway at the moment because they don't have control of that water. Just to give you an indication of some of the discussions that were going on when we did this work, we had a series of focus groups, if you like, discussion groups with what the UN calls key stakeholders, those whose livelihoods depend on immediate access to water, particularly farmers, but also the others that might be impacted by climate change. And we tried to put together the risk of climate change on the right. Each of these circles, the kind of size of the circle or oval, relates to the importance given to this by stakeholders in discussion. So in some way, this is more of a kind of cognitive map, as it were, than a physical sort of objective sort of analysis of climate change risk. But I think it's very important for those very reasons of taking into account experience or perception of climate change, at least in terms of the work we did 10 years ago. This is just for Gaza. There's a separate graphic for the West Bank. Is the immediate impacts or stresses on livelihoods and public health were around groundwater contamination and decreased flows of groundwater or sea level rise, increasing contamination, that contamination increasing, having impacts in terms of lower yields on agriculture, affecting donors. Now, when we originally discussed all the stuff on the right with the stakeholders, they were very keen also to say, well, in terms of our immediate livelihoods, immediate risks in terms of water availability, quality of water, 95% plus of water in Gaza is not fit for human consumption. On the left, and much of the water is contaminated in a way which increases negatively agricultural productivity. On the left, the key stresses are current stresses from the siege or the closure regime. And I won't list this point by point, but you'll see a whole series of factors on the left in terms of the siege or closure, Israeli siege or closure regime, which impact on livelihoods. So we're kind of dealing here in kind of almost a perfect storm of risks, rising climate change risks, compounding existing occupation or siege closure related risks. Okay, and this has impacts both on livelihoods and public health. So I put climate vulnerability in quote marks for this because are we still talking about climate vulnerability when we factor in not just exposure to exogenous climate change impacts, but also vulnerability caused by social, economic, political factors? For me, as a social scientist, you cannot talk meaningfully about climate vulnerability without talking about the extent to which your sensitivity to even to climate change impacts alone are created, are produced by other factors. So this is something that we were trying to figure out, or we're representing this, and this by itself triggered some discussion about in the scholarship from those who are critical of it, saying one said we were naturalizing occupation, pretending that the sort of occupation related factors are as exogenous as climate change, to those that were saying we were wandering too much into politics by talking about occupation, siege, closure, at the same time we're talking about climate change. As many of you will know in the audience, even the language or terms that you use in this context are very, very charged. So I appreciate, I've probably gone for that quite quickly and quite in a broad brush manner, but it's basically, this is just to set up some of the kind of key issues and themes. I would say that climate change is currently less a source of pressure on food and water availability in the region than unsustainable resource governance and demographic change and political economic constraints. Those political economic constraints encompassing both particular governance regimes and situations of exceptional governance, if we're talking about where there's conflict or occupation. Middle Eastern states have made modest governance commitments to climate change, mitigation, adaptation, particularly notable in terms of, because of course they have the resources, with the Gulf states' ambitions to scale up in a significant way clean energy investments. There's certainly a more effective regional scope for cooperation on climate change for the League of Arab States and the GCC. You might say, well, what's the point of doing this? Why worry about regional coordination? Well, at least in terms of international climate change negotiations, states tend to gather together in coalitions or groups. So it's actually important for states in the Middle East to protect their interests, that they make sure they have regional kind of mobilization in international bodies, including the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. And lastly, with that very brief kind of excursus on Israel-Palestine and Syria, climate change, I don't think is, at least not yet, a conflict multiplier in the region, but I think we can say that as in the Gaza situational case, conflict intensifies climate vulnerability. Of course, conflict intensifies other types of vulnerability, social vulnerability, economic vulnerability. So we have to be careful not to necessarily privilege climate vulnerability in relation to these other factors. And again, I would just repeat that sort of claim that I think you can only talk about climate vulnerability in this more holistic way anyway, where you factor in the extent to which climate change stresses compound, intensify stresses from other sources. Okay, thank you. So I think I've gone over time there a little bit, Chris.
No worries at all, Michael. That was a terrific tour de force across the region to look at a number of issues packed full of valuable thoughts and data. I'm going to go straight into questions, and we have a number. We have one from Bernie Howley first. Bernie, are you with us?
I am. I'm not on the screen though because I've got poor connectivity. I've asked I think I might have asked a couple of questions. I can't remember. I certainly thought of some, but this is the first one. Just to ask you, Michael, as a geographer, I too am a geographer, but I was a climatologist and studied climatology in the late 70s, looking at climate change way back then. There's obviously, you know, they're looking at very real physical changes and all of the socioeconomic impact in the region and globally. Do you think that there still persists too much silo thinking, and that there's a real need for a much more holistic and gathered together approach?
In relation to climate change, Bernie? Yeah.
Yeah. Well, the economic effects, the actual changes that are going on of the fluids.
Okay. Yeah.
And, you know, we tend to look at the science of it, and we look at the socioeconomic and political impact, and then we're looking, but does there need to be a greater understanding of the fact that it all connects?
Yes, absolutely, yeah. Chris, so we'll take what, several questions, and then
should we take several questions? Okay,
yeah.
we've got one from Mohammed Isa. Mohammed.
Is the water control the reason behind the Israeli efforts to annex the 20 or 30% of the West Bank?
Okay, and let's take one from Andrew Whitley. Andrew.
Thank you, Chris. So my question is about governance, international governance arrangements. One of the international organizations probably no one has ever heard of is MEDREC. It's one of the product outcomes of the Madrid Peace Conference 30 years ago. And it brings together, for those who don't know it, Palestine, Israel, Jordan, and a number of other countries. It's based in Oman. I'd like to know what you think of it as a model of a governance, and whether it could be replicated in the Persian Gulf region as a whole.
Okay, Michael.
Sorry, I muted myself there. So let me go through these. I've written them down. So first thing, in terms of silo thinking, yeah, I mean, I mentioned in the presentation, I'd actually done a paper on this published last year with a colleague, Aisha Al-Sarihi, on climate integration in Oman and UAE, and we're looking at that specific point on terms of the extent to which often commitments are made by governments to integrate climate change into their decision making, into their economic policy, into their national accounts sometimes, but is it always followed through? And at least in terms of that work we're doing there, looking at talking to people in those two states, the symbolic, if you like, or the discursive commitments to climate change integration weren't matched by the physical kind of continuation of silo-based decision making. And at least in terms of the UAE, the sort of commitment in terms of renewable energy investment is, although it's often talked about in terms of nationally determined contributions as a commitment to climate change decision making, is very much seems to be motivated by other reasons. The reason I said in terms of reducing domestic consumption of fossil fuels to enable more fossil fuels to be sold in international export markets. And I think across the region, I think as a result of there are examples of attempts by states or prospective states to create climate change sort of structures. After we'd done the work with UNDP for the Palestinian Authority, the Palestinians, for example, created a climate change committee. There's actually a Palestinian Authority climate change committee, which has taken forward some of the work on adaptation and very much dependent, of course, on international funding, tried to sort of integrate some of these issues in decision making. Now, that's an exceptional governance context where the Palestinian Authority is very much hampered in doing anything effective because of the nature of the occupation. So it'd be unfair to say that the Palestinian Climate Change Committee is not effectively integrating climate change across other decision-making areas. But I think there are, let's just say that at least there's signs of institutional change in terms of ministries, in terms of climate change portfolio appearing, or being represented at ministerial level, or receiving more resources from a state. I think you can see kind of institutional movement, but I don't think yet that is translated into kind of meaningful changes in terms of economic policy, except insofar as it's reactive. For example, just before this presentation, I'm just reading about a crisis in the Lebanon's pine nut trade because of there was a pest inadvertently introduced into Lebanon. I think it was about 10 years ago, which was a bug sort of Western pine bug, I think it was called, which feeds on pine seeds. It's led to a major collapse in the pine nut harvest in Lebanon. Okay, you can say, well, this is not to do with climate change. However, because of regional temperature rise in Lebanon, the conditions for this bug flourishing are getting more and more kind of conducive to it growing and expanding rapidly. So the government's got to come in and compensate farmers and try to work out, or to try and buy pesticides and to address the dramatic impacts on the pine nut trade. So you come down to these small, these individual events, yeah, and it demonstrates, I think, it's just one example, there's like lots of examples, this reactive thinking. So you have institutional change, impressive soundings made about sort of embracing climate change, but no kind of proactive, integrated sort of climate change thinking, which integrates climate change decision-making into economics, into agriculture, into water policy even sometimes, yeah? So I think that's still some way to go. I mean, talk about water, so that, yeah, what was this, Mohammed, was this, talk about the annexation proposal, yes, on the West Bank? Is it to do with control of water? To a significant extent, yes, because already Israel is in control of the mountain aquifer, yeah, and if you look at the annexation map, it consolidates, institutionalizes the settler-based colonization of the Jordan Valley, which is the richest kind of agricultural area, yeah. And so there's an agricultural kind of rationale there, but of course, you know, it creates, as for a long time, there's been the call to have some kind of, from the Israelis, some kind of separation, land-based separation between any future Palestinian state or statelet and the Jordanian border. So I think that's very much a factor, yeah. But yes, but there's also if you look at the annexation map, or at least proposed annexation map, which supposedly now has dissolved in terms of political reality, because of the Abraham Accords. We shall see. I think we're just going to go back to an incremental de facto annexation as we have at the moment. I think, yes, water control is significant. It's always been a significant part of settler colonization. It remains, for example, I think one of the key reasons for settler colonization of the Golan Heights has been to control sort of key headwaters, some of the key headwaters, Banias River, Hasbani of the Jordan River. And in terms of international governance and MEDREC, could this serve as a model? I think in terms of, if we're looking at, in terms of climate change, integration of climate change, I think you need to have a regional body in which you have significant buy-in from the actors involved in that body, including the lead actors. So if the Saudis, for example, UAE, were really serious about GCC working effectively, that could be the case. And unless you got that buy-in of, if you say the powerful or lead states, then that's not going to happen. And in terms of MEDREC, I don't know, in terms of as an effective body even by itself, let alone as a model for other regional decision making. But at least in terms of climate change, again, the structures are there. There are these structures within the GCC, within the Arab League. It's just a case of filling these out with meaningful political commitments by the states who are members of these regional organizations. I think there's massive potential for, at least with the GCC, of a coordinated regional body. However, you know, we're in a kind of, we're in the real world of realpolitik, where it must fit with the interests of the lead states, the most powerful states, as to how this goes forward. So that's a bit vague as an answer.
Thank you very much, Michael. Okay, we're going to have a few more questions. There's a couple about the impact of sea level rises. So I'm going to ask Diana Dark. Dana, you had one?
Yes, I mean, it's a sort of basic question, really. I mean, I've always assumed that a sea level rise, say in Dubai, of 1 meter would equal 1 meter rise in Gaza. Is that true? And you know, in order to wipe out somewhere like the palm development in Dubai, the Jumeirah palm development, I mean, would 1 meter rise submerge that, for example?
And we have a quite similar question. I'll just quickly read out which Middle East cities are the most threatened by rise in sea levels. And if I could just add to that, perhaps, because I don't know whether you mentioned it, I mean, what will be the impact on the rise in sea levels, you know, on the Nile Delta, when one thinks the most populated country and areas in the region? Over to you.
Yes. So the answer is still with the rise everywhere. In terms of climate change, the sort of the kind of the sea level rise stress is kind of similar, but there are local regional differences. The local regional differences depend, for example, on the depth or shallowness of the waters. So the sort of the relatively shallow waters in the Persian Gulf, Arabian Gulf, whatever your preference, means that with temperature rise, you can get a greater what's called thermal expansion, which means the water can expand more rapidly. Also, if it's a smaller volume of water, so we might anticipate, other things being equal, that rise will be greater off the coast of Abu Dhabi than off the coast of Haifa. So, you know, I haven't studied this in great detail, or haven't, you know, to give you the sort of scientific answer to that, except to say that I know the principles there are that you need to look at this on a sort of a coast-specific basis, yeah. And it's not just the case of the rise can be projected from climate change stresses, but it's not simply a case of how much more water is there out there, which is what we see in a lot of the reporting. The glaciers are mounting, so the ice is mounting. Therefore, there's a certain level of sea level rise expected. That, you know, that's true. At the same time, there are regional impacts depending on the shallowness of the body of water and its properties of expansion and contraction, and also tidal regimes. So, for example, one of the concerns in the Persian Gulf, Arabian Gulf, is that is with desalination plants pumping out brine water into relatively shallow water, and the accelerated impact of that. Whereas if you go onto the Israeli coast, Mediterranean, and I've been to one of their major desalination plants in Ashkelon, they pipe the brine some way out into the sea, which they say removes or at least dilutes the pollution impact of the brine being discharged. So there's a contextual analysis that needs to take place, which would have to take place in specific localities. In terms of specific localities, yeah, I think, you know, the Nile Basin, the Nile Delta, there are scholars who have studied or looking at the impacts on the Nile Delta. These are very significant in terms of sea level rise. If anybody's interested, I could probably refer on some research on this. So we're looking at, I think, in terms of the specific impacts, the impacts also depend, because the sea level rise is not just, as I said, above ground, as it were. It's also in terms of those coastal locations which rely on groundwater aquifers for their water. So, for example, compare Haifa in my graphic to Gaza, Gaza City, and the impact is of course accentuated tremendously for Gaza, in the sense that they are dependent on a groundwater aquifer, which will be impacted by increasing salinization. The Israelis had the technical resources, financial resources, not only to sort of construct more coastal defenses, but also to source their fresh water from other sources, from desalination. So it depends very much on the context. But I think in terms of, if we're to highlight priority areas, we're looking at priority areas where you have a relatively shallow water body, and the coastal area itself, which is receiving the sea level impact, is more vulnerable. So even within a short physical distance, for example, Gaza, of course, is much more vulnerable than Haifa to the same sea level rise.
Just on the issue of desalination, we had a question from Vivian King-Ross, who's asking whether desalination is, the cost of it is markedly lower now than in the 1980s when Saudi Arabia introduced it to underpin its economic diversification. So is it now a more realistic option for poorer countries?
Yes, I mean, I can't give you the figures off the top of my head, but yes, it is cheaper. And one thing which is helping in that extent is the scaling up of desalination technologies, which is making the construction of desalination plant relatively cheaper. Desalination can also take place, it does take place at a smaller level, of course. In Gaza, small reverse osmosis desalination is crucial for delivery of fresh water to the population. So you can do it at different scales. It's interesting. I've been looking with my Iraq work recently at the proposal for a massive desalination plant south of Basra, which the Iraqis and others would say would solve the water problem in southern Iraq with a million cubic meters a year of water. So, you know, large scale desalination plants need a lot of money. However, this is where the international climate change governance comes in. One of the big targets or aims at the Glasgow conference is that the developed countries step up to climate change financing. So that climate change financing can be directed, for example, at desalination plants, which, and this is one of the big technical changes in recent years, is the use of renewable energy for desalination. The Saudis are piloting for their NEOM project a new kind of desalination plant, which is like a large dome, which uses concentrated solar power concentrated into this dome to which is created over seawater to produce fresh water from condensation within this dome. If this is successful, they will scale up this as a major kind of renewable energy sort of desalination producing source. So that ticks the box of both water availability and also, because you don't want to be using fossil fuels for desalination. Some parts of the world which rely heavily on desalination, like Cyprus, I'm thinking of the Republic of Cyprus, are using very dirty, polluting fossil fuel desalination plants. And those are cheaper at the moment still. I think that the great step change is going to renewable energy desalination, for which, at least at the moment, you need major international financing. That could be done for international climate change finance. Then you'd have what happened, I guess, with wind technology, where wind technology several years ago was not viable economically, but now is. So as soon as it becomes viable economically, the private sector piles in. But at least for the initial stages, you need that major international sort of public sector assistance. But I think if you tie that into international climate change governance and finance for developing countries, then this is why I think Middle Eastern states are right to make their nationally determined contributions on emissions conditional on international assistance, technical, financial, because they can say, okay, we'll reduce our emissions. To help us do that, please finance a desalination plant in our country financed by renewable energy, powered by renewable energy.
And on that, because it referenced, we had a question about the Saudi mega projects at NEOM, the Red Sea resorts, the greening of Riyadh. They're presented as climate friendly. In your view, do they have that potential?
At least, it's a big discussion. At least technically, shall we say, there are technologies that they are promoting and financing which seem to be favoring large-scale experimentation in and upscaling of renewable energy technology. The one I mentioned, that's sort of the CSP desalination dome being, you know, perhaps the most recent. However, when we talk about climate change adaptation, I think increasingly, and we see this with the work of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change on climate change adaptation, there's a lot of at least scholarly and policy recognition now that climate change transitioning, in other words, transitioning to a sort of low carbon economy or society, must be done in a fair way. And some of you will know there's all sorts of issues with the Saudi NEOM proposal about removal of certain peoples that live there against their wills, about lack of participation, consultation, and so forth. So I think we have to be careful not to treat this purely as a technical exercise, because if we do, we might lose the sense of the extent to which these climate change interventions that happen within societies, happen within polities, happen within economies. And so I think you must make the judgment in the round with that kind of holistic view.
Well, we've come to the end of our hour, so unfortunately we can't take any more questions, but it remains me to thank Michael for sparing his time and his expertise, because it's really been terrific. Thank you also to everyone who's attended today and all your questions. I'm sorry for those who didn't manage to get them in, but hopefully we will have other chances, as I said earlier, at Caabu to host such talks. And for those of you who are not members, please do join up. There's plentiful links on our website to do so. We'll be sending around links to the recording, which will be out on our website as well, so people can share it with their friends and watch it and spread the knowledge. Joe's kindly circulated a link to the membership join up on our website. So thank you, everybody. Do have a great summer, as it's hopefully going to kick off even in Britain soon.
Chris,
enjoy yourselves.
Chris, can I finish with that? Not only with thanks to you and the audience for those great questions, but just a quick advert is the next month, or actually later this month, I've got a policy brief coming out with the Middle East Centre, LSE, on the water infrastructure issues in southern Iraq. And if people are interested, I'll be happy to come back to this forum, for example, to talk about, if you like, more specific research. So if anybody's interested in water infrastructure in Iraq, keep checking out the Middle East Centre website, LSE, or contact me directly. But thank everybody for coming to this, and thank you, Chris and Caabu and Joe, for setting this up so efficiently.
It's a great pleasure, and we'll look forward to getting that paper, and we will circulate it to people at the time. So thank you, everybody. Stay safe and have a great summer.